in the audience. Great to see some old familiar faces and friends, and greetings to all of you out there in Zoom land. I hope you're doing well. My name is David Clay Large, and I'm now a 10-year veteran at Prof. It's been 10 years. There you go. 10 years. A good 10 years. I always say it's my favorite teaching experience, absolutely, in my career. Now, the course I'm offering this winter term at Prof is on Berlin, as the title there suggests. The history of the city from 1871, when Germany was unified for the first time and Berlin became the capital, up to the present. That's a tall order, of course. But I wanted to make it this broad because, as you'll see as we get going through the course, I think there's certain patterns that evolve over the years, many beginning around the time of the unification in the early 70s. And so, you know, I thought at one point, well, I'll just do Babylon, Berlin, which everybody's so fascinated with, the Weimar era, and maybe take it up to the present. But my feeling is you really can't appreciate or truly understand what happened in the Weimar period unless you know something about what went on when Berlin actually became the capital for the first time. So hence the scope of all of this. There's an awful lot of material. I'll try to keep it in control and accessible. But it's a tall order, no question about that. I chose Berlin in part because, you know, like Vienna, it's a city that has played a very important role in my own life. I studied in Vienna in school, both in high school and later in college, part of my college. And when I was in school in Vienna back in the early 60s, I went up to Berlin for just a few days to kind of check out the place about which I'd heard so much. The Berlin Wall, as it happened, had just gone up a couple of years before I got there, and thereby, you know, showing just the topical resonance of this city. It really was a happening place. It seemed more than ever to be the capital of the Cold War. And you know, Vienna has that about it as well, but so does Berlin. While I was there that first time as a young kid, of course, I went to the Berlin Wall, and then also went over to East Berlin for a bit. When I went to the wall, I went to Brandenburg Gate, where there was a big viewing platform, right? I'm sure some of you have been to Berlin during the wall period. You probably did the same thing. You can go up on those viewing platforms and look over the wall and check out the other side. I did that, and of course, wise ass that I was, I gave the finger to the guard who was on the other side. Well, this didn't turn the Cold War hot. He just gave me the finger right back. That's the way it goes. You know, but what this experience did for me in Berlin, it was a short one, but it really whetted my appetite for the study of the great Central European cities like Berlin. And that would become then the main business of my professional life, that is writing and teaching about Central Europe, and especially its great cities, Prague, Vienna, Warsaw, and so forth, and so on. So again, my interest in Berlin does derive from a lot of personal experience. I kept going back to Berlin over the years because I was becoming a German historian. I studied it at Berkeley with Karl Schorske and with Jerry Feldman and with some great German historians there. And I kept going back for research on various projects. And I also got involved with German TV. I've done a number of documentaries for German television, both for Bayerischer Rundfunk and Norddeutscher Rundfunk and Berliner Rundfunk. These are all the stations I worked for. And I worked early on a series that you may know called Berlin, Babylon, Babylon, Berlin. But we parted ways because I thought they were over the top on the debauch. And they were missing what I thought were some important parts of the story. But I keep going back to Berlin. I published a full-scale kind of biography of the city. In fact, the German edition is called Biographie einer Stadt. It came out in 2000, and then the German edition in 2002. And then I wrote books about the German-hosted Olympics, especially Berlin in '36, and another book on the Holocaust, and that kept me in the city an awful lot. And that for that I was always very grateful. It was so much fun to go back to Berlin. And the most interesting time, perhaps, that I was there was in October of 1989. Just before the wall came down. Of course, I had no idea that the wall was going to come down. Nobody did, by the way. I mean, this was really a big surprise. Don't let people tell you that they knew what was going to happen. They didn't. Anyway, so there I was in October. As was my usual habit, I did go over to the east. I went to the Friedrichstrasse crossing. And smart ass that I still was, even though many years later, I said to the guard there as I was handing over my passport, I must be the only one stupid enough to go in this direction, because everybody else was fleeing. They were fleeing into the west, and I was there practically by myself. Well, the guard didn't think that was funny, but instead of just getting the finger back, I was made to sit in detention for several hours and contemplate the sorry state of my soul. The charge was what the Germans call Staatsbeleidigung, lèse-majesté, or defaming the state. I'd have been a lot happier had I known at that point that the wall was going to come down in another month or so, and then another year after that, the state that I had allegedly defamed would be gone as well, right? So that was 1989, and the most recent time I went back was in October of 2023. I took that trip in part just to do some last-minute research for this course. And that turned out to be a fascinating visit, because I arrived just after the Hamas attack on Israel, right? Which had huge implications for Berlin. Berlin has a very large Muslim population, especially in a district called Neukölln. So while I was there, I went over to Neukölln and witnessed a demonstration. First, let me show you. Here we've got the wall, famously coming down. It didn't, of course, come down. It just it was taken down months later with huge equipment. But this is what I saw in Neukölln in October of '23. 67 police were injured in that riot, and a synagogue was firebombed. At the same time, or a few days later, I went to a very different kind of demo. This really in favor of Israel, and also, of course, I think for peace. People wanted this damn thing to end. I mean, it was such a tragic business. And what that taught me was something that I actually already knew, but it was reinforced, and that is how deeply divided Berlin is within itself. I mean, most cities have that, of course. Paris, as we know, does. Amsterdam does, and so forth, and so on. Brussels. But boy, Berlin really has it in spades, and it can get nasty really quickly. I think I was probably foolish to stay as long as I did in Neukölln, because I could have been hurt. A lot of people were. Of less import, but nonetheless worthy of mention in the present context with respect to my visits to Berlin, was on that recent one, I went to a museum. Berlin is, by the way, filled with museums. It's the greatest museum city in the world, I think. Went to a museum focusing on the history of Berlin. It's in the new Humboldt Forum, by the way. Anyway, I went there and I stumbled across an exhibit displaying the first rubber-based, vacuum-sealed, mass-produced condom, which had been invented in Berlin in 1916 by a German Jewish chemist by the name of Julius Fromm, or Fromm. And he called his product der Frommser, or just Fromms. Fromms. All right, yeah. And you'll be happy to know that this product is still available today. Now it's just called Fromms. And you might want to go out and pick one of those up, but maybe not. Anyway, I just thought it was pertinent to mention Berlin's contribution to contraception within the confines of a Catholic university. All right. So now when you think of from, you can always think of, and yeah, there's a double meaning there. So just a bit now, still by way of introduction, regarding the central premises, some of the central ideas of this course. We're going to treat Berlin over the last century and a half as a laboratory of modernism. Modernism in the social sense, modernism technical and infrastructural, engineering, but above all cultural, right? I think that's, I call this course, modernist metropolis because Berlin really is a mecca for all kinds of different forms of modernism. And that has had its shadow sides to it, as we'll see as we go along. It's a city that is constantly reinventing itself. Not just, it doesn't just invent new products and so forth and so on, like this condom, but it reinvents itself so much so that it's really hard to know what its actual personality is. There's very little coherence to it, and a lot of Berliners take pride in that, the fact that it remains a moving target, and it's always been difficult for the Berliners to come to grips with their own past. They're either destroying it or they're trying to reckon with it and what it has meant. Because if you reinvent yourself a lot, you automatically have an ambiguous or ambivalent relationship with your own past. But no city has more ghosts in the closet or skeletons in the closet, whatever you want to call them, than Berlin, right? You can't piss without hitting some kind of, you can't throw a stone without hitting some kind of memory site or place where some terrible thing happened or some warning site. And of course, the most famous of all of them that I'm sure most of you, many of you have seen, is the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe. This was a very controversial monument. Not so much the idea that it would be there, but how it should look and how you could in any way capture such a thing in a monument. A very tricky thing to do, but it's just the most famous of many hundreds, really hundreds of what the Germans call memory sites throughout the city. And we'll be talking about some of those as we go along, but it points up the difficulty that the city has in dealing with its own very complicated past. Despite all these jarring disjunctions in the modern history of Berlin, there are certain themes that keep popping up, and I want to emphasize those as we go along. One of those themes is the tension that has existed really from the beginning between the governors and the governed. Of course, you can say that about just about any place, but in Berlin, it's been especially strong because it has caused so much distaste and discomfort among the people who run the country. Whether it was Hitler or Bismarck or Kaiser Wilhelm II, Konrad Adenauer, later on, even Helmut Kohl. They all had trouble in various ways with Berlin, right? So that's one pattern that we're going to keep talking about. There's also been tension between Berlin and the rest of Germany. Now, again, that's not uncommon in this country. Famously, there's a kind of culture war going on between, say, New York City and rural America, between San Francisco and rural America. Well, that's an old story, but that's true in spades for Berlin. There's also been a lot of international trepidation over Berlin's evolving stature and importance. Not everybody was happy outside Germany about the unification of the country, or the fact that then a Prussian capital became capital of Germany, right? That was a red flag for an awful lot of people, especially in France and in Britain. We'll hear more about that later on. Another theme has to do with the German capital's pressing ambitions to catch up with and maybe even surpass other national capitals. Remember, Berlin was, I should say Germany was reunified late, right? Not until 1870, 71. And then so Berlin doesn't become a national capital until then. And they started with a kind of inferiority complex. There was Paris, there was Rome, there was London, and so forth. And so right from the beginning, there's this frantic attempt really to catch up as fast as possible to show the rest of the world that they're just as good when it comes to urban sophistication, say, as the French, as London or and Paris and so forth and so on. Yet another theme that I want to go into, and this would be especially true for the Weimar period, but it's also true for earlier on, and that is the dependence of Berlin on the global marketplace for its own prosperity and social political health. Again, as I said early on, you can't study Berlin without looking at a broader picture, and that's especially true when it comes to economics. So you have to put Berlin in these broader perspectives and look at these patterns, and that's what we're going to do. And we'll see right now as we start with the Bismarckian period that most of those patterns that I already mentioned were there from the beginning and get rooted in that time. All right, let's turn to Berlin becoming the national capital. As I'm sure most of you know, Germany emerged as a nation through war. I don't have time here to go into all the wars. There were three key ones, but the point is that Berlin wouldn't have become a national capital without war, without military prowess. So it's not surprising that one of Berlin's first acts as national capital was to celebrate with a huge military parade. So here you have this parade going through the Brandenburg Gate back in 1871, to be more precise, June 16th, 1871. About 40,000 soldiers, many of them bearing captured French battle flags, marched through the gate down unter den Linden to the royal palace. The people marching at the head of this parade bear mentioning because they're the ones that sealed the unification. There were generals like Helmut von Moltke, I'm sure you've heard of him, Albrecht von Roon, and then right at the start, this guy, Otto von Bismarck, he became a prince. He is the true architect of German unification, no doubt about that. He was there at the front along with the man his work helped put on the throne. That's Kaiser Wilhelm I. He had been the king of Prussia up until 1871. But then when Germany became unified, he was chosen as the Kaiser, or the emperor of this new German state. And significantly enough, the selection process was celebrated in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, just to rub salt into French wounds. And this was much celebrated, of course, in Germany. We'll have more to say about Kaiser Wilhelm as we go along. Berlin itself, for this majestic parade, was decked out in all kinds of martial splendor, again, indicating the military nature of the unification. There were oak leaf garlands captured from the French. There were cannons captured from the French. And there was also a 20-meter statue of Berolina, who's the patron goddess of Berlin. She too is a martial figure. There's Berolina. Other statuary along the parade route symbolized the annexed French territories of Alsace and Lorraine, which would remain bones of contention between Germany and France for the next 75 years. I'm sure you're also familiar with that story, that the Germans took over this region, which had flipped back and forth over the years between German and French control. The language is a mixture there of Alsatian, is a mixture of German and French. But the Germans grab it, and that was obviously a huge bone of contention between France and Germany. The pomp of this huge parade was the largest one Berlin had ever seen to date. The pomp cost a huge amount, some $450,000. The thaler was still the coinage in those days. But that expense was borne chiefly by the Berliners themselves via a surcharge on income taxes levied in the city. But few Berliners complained about this because the festivities offered plenty of opportunity to recoup the tax in the form of extra revenue that people could make on hotels, right, and restaurants, taverns, the last of which dispensed a special commemoration brew costing a few pennies more than the normal stuff. And meanwhile, there were street vendors all over the place making their own pretty pennies from dispensing a war and victory parade chronicle. There were lots of picture postcards. Here is one of the parade. And there was even a guide to Berlin's nightlife, which was just starting to pick up in vigor, although it still had a long way to go before it would reach the full debauch of Babylon Berlin in the 20s. This guidebook that came out with the parade, it didn't even have any reference to the city's bordellos, of which there were already quite a few. Nonetheless, whorehouses or no whorehouses, the swagger and bombast that was on display in Berlin during this parade aptly captured, I think, the mood and the mentality of Bismarckian Germany and its capital city at this particular time. A lot of swagger, a lot of chest beating, a lot of gloating, no question about that. But at the same time, there were signs this was a city a little unsure of itself and very much on the make, wanting to, as I said earlier, prove itself as a major European capital. It wasn't that in 1871 at all. It wanted to catch up. And that process of trying to catch up starts with a bang, almost literally, in 1871. Pleased as most Berliners were with the city's new status as capital, many Germans elsewhere around the Reich were not so happy to have Berlin as their national capital. Remember, I mentioned tensions between the city and outside. They cropped up immediately. Remember that Berlin was Prussia's capital, and Prussians were not beloved in other parts of Germany necessarily, right? I mean, there was a lot of hostility there. There had been wars, there were civil wars, most famous one in 66 that involved the Austrians against the Prussians, but also the Bavarians against the Prussians, right? So there's a lot of lingering hostility there and disgruntlement over this development, which came so suddenly as a result of France's collapse in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71. So Germans in other parts of the New Reich, say from Baden in the southwest, or Saxony in the east, or the Rhineland in the west, they all resisted Prussian power and bitched to high heaven over this development, which they feared would overwhelm the rights and prerogatives that they retained, that their special provinces retained in the new imperial constitution, which was quite federalist in design. I mean, it gave a lot of states' rights, so to speak. But the people in states like Saxony, which was actually a kingdom, as was Bavaria at this time, really worried that with these damn Prussians running the show, those rights would be tossed aside and they'd be left kowtowing to the Preußen, right? And just as in the young USA, there was in Wilhelmian Germany a lot of fear of hypercentralization. We don't like the idea that power is concentrated in one place. It needs to be dispersed. So there were people in Frankfurt that said their city should be, Hessians who have Frankfurt as a capital said they wanted Frankfurt. The people in Saxony wanted Leipzig or Dresden. The Catholic West The Rhineland would have preferred Cologne or even Aachen, where Charlemagne had been based way back in 800. They all thought that these places, their places, were much more civilized and historically significant than upstart Berlin, which was not only heavily Protestant, but with its eastern location very close to Poland, it had a huge Slavic population and was seen as not even German by a lot of people in other parts of the Reich. It was really seen as some kind of weird other alien place out there on the East Elbian steppes. Kind of scary. Least happy of all with Berlin as the new capital were the Bavarians, right? Whose defeat in 1866 had been crucial to the unification process, and whose old capital, Munich, with its beautiful Italianate architecture and easygoing southern atmosphere, generated among the Bavarians a combination of bitter resentment and smug superiority relative to Berlin. That would never go away, by the way. You still find it today. You'll talk to certain Münchners, Bavarians about Berlin, and you'll get a load of that. Here's a shot of Munich. I spent a long time in Munich because I wrote a history of that city as well. It is beautiful. It's much prettier than Berlin. There's no question about that. I think, but it goes beyond beauty. It's really a function of a different personality and a different language, really, among the Bavarians. There's a Bayerische language and also a Bavarian dialect. It's very different than Berlinerisch, which is spoken up there in the capital. The Prussians themselves might be thought to have been really happy and enthusiastic uniformly about this fact that their own capital now had become the German capital, but that wasn't the case. There were a lot of Prussians, especially really conservative Prussians, who worried that the traditional values and customs of their particular state would be overwhelmed as the capital became invaded by all kinds of alien elements, from other parts of Germany and Europe. The novelist Theodor Fontane, a favorite of mine, great writer, was one of those conservative Prussians, born and raised in Prussia, who thought that cities like Berlin couldn't really be truly Prussian because they lacked connection to the earth, because they didn't provide possibilities for serious thinking and communion with nature and all the rest of it. So he was dead set against the idea that Berlin become the national capital. And even the political leader chiefly responsible for Berlin's elevation to national capital status, namely the great Bismarck himself, was no great fan of the city on the Spree. Spree River is one of the rivers that flows through Berlin. He wasn't happy. Well, I shouldn't say he wasn't happy because he helped orchestrate the fact that Berlin became the capital, but he didn't like it. He didn't really like the place. And his ambivalence about this metropolis foreshadows something I mentioned earlier, the fact that many leaders down the line, whether we're talking about Kaiser Wilhelm II, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, Konrad Adenauer, and others, they all have this ambivalence about Berlin, which I think is almost unique in European history. The degree to which a city, a major city like Berlin, evokes so much, ambivalence and doubt and questioning and wondering, is this the right thing? We'll see later when we get to our last lecture that there was a big debate about whether Berlin should return as capital in 1990 after the reunification of Germany. And a lot of people did not want that. They wanted Bonn to stay as a capital. It was nip and tuck for Berlin to become capital again. So this is, again, we're dealing with patterns here. I think you can't really understand what happened in 1990 without knowing that Berlin was always the subject of such internal questioning and ambiguity. Bismarck, remember, was a Prussian Junker, that is an aristocratic landowner with estates. And he always felt much more comfortable out there on his estates than in the concrete jungle of the city, which he said was always full of pale faces and nasty urban smells. As he said, in fact, to the members of the new national parliament, the Reichstag, and here I'm quoting him, I would much rather live in the country than among you people, charming as you are. Accordingly, Chancellor, and that he took the Chancellor as the Prime Minister, of course, of Germany. He avoided the capital as much as he could. He stayed away from the place, preferring to rule from his country estates, Pforzheim and Friedrichsruh, the latter of which was gifted to him by public subscription for his successful role in bringing Germany together. So that's Friedrichsruh. There's a museum there now. You can go see it should you be so inclined. It's worth the visit. Ambivalence about Berlin as imperial capital was further reflected in the very tentative and haphazard manner in which the Reich government actually established itself physically in the city. Bismarck's bête noire, the Reichstag building, or the Reichstag Parliament, didn't get a new building of its own until 1894, by which time Bismarck was out of power. In the meantime, before that Reichstag building was completed, the new national parliament had to meet and do business in an abandoned porcelain factory whose glass ceiling was always falling apart and dropping shards of sharp glass down onto the deputies, much to the delight of Bismarck, by the way. This is what the place looked like. You can see this, there's this was falling down all the time and cutting up the not a great place to do your business. But it was an indication, again, of the haphazard way in which the city sort of came together as a capital. Bismarck's government neglected not only the Reichstag, but also provided little financial support for the physical establishment of ministries and administrative offices in the city. Most of these entities had to rent space in private houses, or they moved into repurposed palaces in and around the Wilhelmstrasse, where some of the older Prussian state offices had been quartered. Wilhelmstrasse, you hear that term all the time. It would become soon very similar. It would take on the same international political significance as, say, London's Whitehall, or Paris's Quai d'Orsay, maybe Washington's Foggy Bottom, and so forth. But it didn't have that cachet early on, and it certainly had a very provisional look, as you can see from that particular slide. Now I want to move on to what I call boomtown on the Spree. Berlin really did become a boomtown, almost like a mining town out in the Old West or something of that sort. The doubts that Bismarck and many other Germans harbored about their new capital did nothing to dampen Berlin's physical and economic expansion. It exploded in size right after the unification. I mean, never has a city grown quite that fast. And the rapidity of this growth and its lack of control, its lack of any monitoring or planning meant that it really did make this new capital look like a giant mining camp, or something you'd find in the Sierra in the 1840s or 50s. It was a very wild, raw kind of place in all sorts of ways, filled with people who were extremely ambitious to make their mark, to make a quick buck if they could, just as they would in a mining community or a place like San Francisco, where you could be one of the purveyors to the miners and therefore make even more money. The growth was so fast in Berlin and so ruthless in running over any historical impediments to progress that this boomtown on the Spree seemed increasingly bereft of any coherent identity or sense of continuity. It was settling into what one commentator at the time called its modern fate, namely that of always becoming and never being. It just seemed always in flux. You couldn't put your finger on the damn place. And there's some of that still today. I'd say that there's more coherence now than there was early on, but this place is still figuring itself out, trying to do so. As for population growth, which I mentioned a second ago, this was astounding. Berlin had a population in 1871 of about 865,000, right? Not too big. But it passed the million mark in 6 years. It catapulted that quickly. And then it reached 2 million by the early 20th century. I mean, 1903 and 1904, it was already about that. Here's a graph of population. There's two huge spurts. What I'm talking about is this one, and then there was an even bigger one here. But this is a little odd because a lot of refugees came streaming in. We'll talk about this in the Weimar period. They came streaming in to get out of other places like Russia and Eastern Europe. So it's almost all refugees, right? But that early growth was a little more organic. But the fact is that no city had grown quite so fast. And so it's not surprising that comparisons were made between Berlin and not European cities, but rather places like New York City and especially Chicago, which, as you know, grew very, very quickly. Mark Twain famously called Berlin, which he visited, the Chicago of Europe in the 1890s. There's a slide that sort of gives some indication of the city growing at that point. Like Chicago and New York City, Berlin grew mainly by dint of large-scale immigration, not sudden fecundity on the part of the residents, but unlike, say, Chicago or New York, the newcomers in this case generally came from surrounding rural regions close to Berlin, like Brandenburg or Silesia. That's where the vast majority of people came in at this point. Later, it would be from overseas and that sort of thing, but not so much early in the 70s and 80s. But just like Chicago or New York or San Francisco, Bismarckian Berlin owed much of its rawness, but also its growing vitality and excitement to those newcomers, right? They really were important in generating a new excitement about this city. Berlin had been pretty dull, actually, earlier on compared to what it was now. Significantly, a considerable number of those newcomers were Jews from the Prussian provinces or from Eastern Europe, especially the Russian-controlled areas of Poland and Russia itself. I'm sure you're aware that in those days, 1880s in particular, huge pogroms in Russia and in Poland, Jews fleeing to Berlin in some ways just for safety, just for protection. But also because they could find opportunity there that they weren't allowed to pursue back in their homelands. In 1860, Berlin had only 18,900 Jews, but by 1890, that figure had risen to 53,900. And most of these were so-called what the Germans call Ostjuden, or Eastern Jews, right? With their very distinctive dress, their very distinctive mannerisms. They were, most of them, very Orthodox. They were, as I said, seeking a safe haven from racial persecution, but also a kind of promised land of economic and religious freedom, because by now in Germany, Jews did have religious freedom and social and political equality as well. I'm not saying there wasn't anti-Semitism, but at least by law, they had rights and privileges that they certainly didn't have in Russia or Poland. This would happen again, by the way, where Berlin becoming a sanctuary for Jews in the Soviet period, when thousands fled, first after the Bolshevik Revolution and then later in the 1990s. So in Berlin, Jews could take maximum advantage of the talents that they'd honed as a result of past discrimination. Back home, they weren't allowed to be landowners. They weren't allowed to pursue certain crafts. They couldn't be in the state service. So they became experts at home in commerce and in finance, to some degree in journalism and the arts, also in medicine and law. And these were precisely the fields that were most in demand in a modernizing city, right? So what we have to see here is just how important it was for this, for Berlin, to have this influx of people who were skilled and could be skilled in these modern kinds of pursuits in law, I said, in medicine, in the arts, of course in banking and in commerce. They then, the Jews coming in, most of them, again, Ostjuden, they bring their own distinctive style with them and their own traditions of irreverence and caustic wit, the famous Jewish wit, which combines with an old pattern in Berlin of a sort of irreverent, caustic quality called Berliner Schnauze. I don't know if you heard that term, but it's kind of hard to translate. It means to be sort of a wise ass, to have a bit of cutting, a nastiness to your way of speaking. This cartoon you see up there is a portrayal, an attempted portrayal of Berliner Schnauze. The lady is saying to a little girl, Frida, if you went shopping as often as your mom, you'd be just as porky, So it's that kind of thing. And then my point being here that Berlin was much enlivened in this period, very early on, by this influx of Jews coming in from the East who helped make it what it was. That would have a shadow side to it, of course, as well, because there were those who hated this modernity, who thought it was irreverent and terrible, and who blamed the Jews for it. So, I mean, it cuts both ways. But you couldn't have the Berlin that you got to have starting in the 80s and 90s without this influx. That's why I stress it. Of course, there was Berlin had its share of racists at the time who resented this influx and did their best to make the newcomers feel miserable. They couldn't discriminate them so much legally because, again, by law, there were certain rights that people had. But there was all kinds of social discrimination that went on, and we'll see more and more of that as we go along. But I want to mention also that the discrimination against these newcomers, these Ostjuden, came not just from Gentile racists and bigots, but from very established, very wealthy, acculturated Jews in Berlin. Remember, the laws had been changed to grant freedom and possibilities for work in the early to mid 19th century in Germany, so that you had in the German states, and so you had German Jews who had managed to do quite well for themselves. They were bankers, they were industrialists, and so forth and so on, and they were heavily acculturated. They thought of themselves as German first and Jewish second, and they certainly didn't run around in a kaftan, and they didn't have long beard. They were very much German, and a lot of them really feared and resented these Ostjuden coming in because they thought it would accelerate anti-Semitism. Of course, they were right to some degree. It did. And so there was discrimination there too against these people. Nonetheless, they settled in and they became very much part of the Berlin tapestry and would continue to do so up until today, when you can find still Ostjuden colonies in Germany, in Berlin. Those wealthy, acculturated Jews had their own headquarters in Berlin, and it was a magnificent place indeed. The so-called Neue Synagoge in Berlin, that's an exterior shot. Here's the interior of the Neue Synagoge. This was a real palace, and it was emblematic of the wealth, the tremendous wealth that the acculturated, more established Jews had in Berlin. I should also mention that although Jews were associated with modernism, not all Jews were modernists by inclination at all. Some of them weren't even in the slightest, but they got equated with modernism, whether they themselves personally were in favor of modern art, for example, or modern dance, whatever, whether they had that inclination or not, Jews were associated with modernity in Berlin. And that, again, could be problematic down the line when the economy began to fail, when modern innovations, economic innovations and doctrines seemed to falter. Then who got blamed? Well, we know. In the meantime, as Berlin is growing so dramatically, it's not surprising that the biggest problem, the most pressing problem for those coming into the city was finding housing. I mean, the city simply wasn't ready for this sort of influx. There had been housing shortages in Berlin earlier on, but nothing like the one that occurred when, after unification, the city grew as quickly as it did. So housing shortage became absolutely acute. And to accommodate the rising demand for shelter, dozens of private building societies moved into the city, and various speculators who began throwing up dwelling spaces as fast and as quick and dirty as they could. Much of the new development occurred in suburbs ringing the old core of the city. And the signature structure of this new dwelling, the new development in the suburbs, the signature structure was the so-called Mietskaserne, which means literally a rental barracks. These are designed to maximize profits at the expense of the inhabitants. There's no other way of putting it. I mean, some of them had their charms, but typically they were sprawling structures, typically 5 stories high, covering entire blocks, as you can see there, in dense honeycombs of apartments built around inner courtyards, just large enough for a fire engine to turn around in. That was the only regulation on the Mietskaserne, that they had to have courtyards a fire truck could turn around, fire engine could turn around in. These inner courtyards were accessed by long sort of corridors from the street. And the further you went in, the darker these inner courtyards became. And in those courtyards, flat redders competed for space and for air with some factories, small craft shops opened in these Mietskaserne, ensuring that there would be the pounding of hammers and the buzz of saws, joining with the wails of kids and the chatter of housewives to produce the iconic babble of the Mietskaserne. Fascinating places, very productive in many ways. Lots of interesting innovations came out of those places, but also disease. You can imagine how unsanitary most of these places were. They didn't get much sunlight. They didn't have much in the way of sanitary facilities, none at all in some cases. And so they were perfect incubators for diseases like cholera, typhus, and smallpox, of which Berlin suffered terribly in the 70s and 80s. But even the cockroach-ridden Mietskaserne were too expensive, became too expensive as the increasing demand for housing drove up rental prices. The consequence of this was widespread homelessness, what the Germans called Obdachlosigkeit, right? Lots and lots of homelessness, and the proliferation of a phenomenon called the Schlafbursche. Here's a squalor in working class housing, and here is a late arriving Schlafbursche from a cartoon by Heinrich Zille, who was the best chronicler of Bismarckian era Berlin. The Schlafbursche is somebody who rents space on the floor or under a stairway or something like that, just for a night. You know, and he's supposed to come at a certain time, and he's got to leave in the morning, and that's it. He just rents that. So there was a lot of that. There were thousands and thousands of Schlafbursche. This arrangement, however, could not accommodate families who often found themselves camping out under bridges or living on construction sites and the rest of it. Sensing a profit in such destitution, a packing carton manufacturer advertised, here I'm quoting, "good and cheap boxes for habitation." You could buy a cardboard box to live in, and that's what a lot of people had to do. So huge shanty towns sprang up around Berlin. There's just a drawing of one of these places, but they were pretty primitive, and of course terrible also in terms of health and the rest of it. The squatters were resented. They were thought to be carriers of disease. We should be familiar with all of this in San Francisco. In the summer of 1872, the authorities decided to crack down on these homeless encampments and throw them out, get them the hell out of there. And so they sent in the police. The squatters rioted, and a huge war developed between soldiers and police on the one hand, and homeless people on the other. The police finally prevailed by simply cutting down the homeless with their sabers. They just dismembered and beheaded a whole bunch of them. That's one way to deal with the homeless problem. But homelessness and destitution, for all of their appalling visibility, were not really the defining motifs of boomtown Berlin in the 70s and 80s. The defining elements that I want to stress now in the next few minutes, these were breathtaking commercial and industrial expansion, material excess, beyond belief excess, and municipal hubris. Those are what I think are the most defining qualities of this period, not just of this period, but especially of this time. Germany's economic boom was behind this, and Berlin was the chief profiter from this boom. And why did you have such an economic boom? Well, there were three factors. First, the unification brought the elimination of all internal tariffs within the German states. It used to be that, if you were sending a product from one part of the German region to another, you'd have to cross state lines, and there would be tariffs. Those were gone, sort of like the EU, right? It was gone with unification. Then there was the liberalization of rules governing banks and joint stock companies. These were really liberalized. There'd been real scrutiny about banks earlier on, and any kind of primitive joint stock operations. These were eliminated after unification. And so, boy, that opened up a free playing field. And finally, there was an infusion of 5 billion gold marks in war reparations from France, of which Berlin got most. This was extraordinary. It meant that every German, man, woman, child, whatever, got 2 carats of pure gold. That's what it amounted to, these 5 billion. Here's a French cartoon of the sacks of gold that got delivered to the Germans as a result of the Franco-Prussian War. As I said, Berlin got a part of this gold rush, and so Berlin can be said to have grown up with a golden spoon in its mouth. Here's, of course, another parallel with San Francisco. Awash now in investment funds, Berlin became a mecca for truly ambitious entrepreneurs, with hardly a week going by without some new factory, bank, newspaper operation, book publisher opening up in the town. Germany's biggest banks, the Deutsche, Dresdner, and Darmstädter banks, all moved their headquarters from Hesse or Saxony to Berlin. Berlin now became the banking capital. It's not anymore, Frankfurt is, but it was in the 70s. The new nation's largest industrial firm, which was August Borsig, which had been building locomotives, railway locomotives for, in Berlin since 1850, now spread out in a huge new complex, factory complex in Moabit in Berlin. This is north of the Spree, an enormous complex. In addition, excuse me, to its factory complex in Moabit, the Borsig family, its empire, built an enormous mansion on the Wilhelmstrasse to announce to the world its huge success. I mentioned material excess being part of the story. Well, you have these enormous mansions being built by these entrepreneurs, some of them in the Wilhelmstrasse, others in Charlottenburg. Later, it would be out in Grunewald. And with heavy industry invading the city suburbs, you had a lot of industrial workers now dominating the city's workforce. Berlin wasn't a big industrial center before, but now it became so factory-oriented that 53.6% of the population in 1871 was working class. That's enormous, right? And it changed the atmosphere in the city. Suddenly, you've got a very powerful working class constituency there who would start agitating for their own rights and privileges and clout. Germany's newspaper industry also moved to Berlin at this point, and set up huge enterprises across the city. Berlin in the 80s and 90s would have more newspapers per capita than any other place in the world. There's Rudolf Mosse. He ran his own Verlag, his own publishing house, and his own newspaper empire. The most prominent of which was the Berliner Tageblatt, the daily, the daily blot in Berlin. He launched that in 1871 with the following, I think, very revealing comment. Let me quote. At a time when the eyes of the world look toward Berlin, we present to the public the Berliner Tageblatt. The capital of Prussia has become the capital of Germany, a world city. We must be inspired by the thought that he who writes for Berlin writes for the entire civilized world. Very revealing, this idea that we're now going to be representative of what's civilized, not so much other places. But as important to Berlin's growth and world city aspiration that these newspapers truly were, the real, I don't know, the real core, or the real most emblematic sign of Berlin's status now was the bourse, was the stock market, right? Berlin built this incredible stock market. There you see it, huge stock market. This was the new temple, if you will, for Berlin on the make, the true heart of boomtown Berlin. All sorts of Berliners, even poor ones, even workers, began to worship at this particular shrine, which was dubbed every man's temple of temptation, and that wasn't for nothing. The priests in this temple were, they varied in social and religious identity, but quite a lot of them were Jewish. That's not surprising. Jews had, of course, worked in finance earlier on due to restrictions about usury and so forth in Christianity. It's an old story. Anyway, they took advantage of the liberalized business climate that I described earlier, and took advantage of their own full legal and civil rights to stake out a very prominent position in banking, just as they would do in newspapers and in department stores. I'll talk about those department stores later. But as for banking, Jewish families had long been important, but following unification, they controlled 40% of all banks in the Reich and 70% of Berlin banks. Now, this also would have its shadow side, as you can well imagine. There was a lot of resentment about that, but there it was. And they were good at it. And one of the most prominent names in banking at this point was this man, Moritz Borchardt, who opened a bank at Französische Straße 32. There's a book about this written by a friend of mine, which became the heart, really, of banking in those days. And it was called Französische Straße, that is French Street, because it was that was the old center for Huguenot settlement in Berlin. When the Edict of Nantes was revoked, then a lot of Huguenots fled France into Germany for religious freedom. And the Borchardt family was not Huguenot, it was Jewish, but they set up their headquarters in this building, which would be a significant place for Jewish culture and Jewish banking all the way up into the Nazi period, when finally, of course, they were kicked out, not surprisingly. Another significant name, Jewish name, especially during the banking, the Bismarckian era in banking was Gersten Bleichruder. Fascinating figure who happened to be the personal banker of none other than Otto von Bismarck. This connection between Bleichruder and Bismarck enabled Bleichruder to become one of the wealthiest men in Germany and to build a huge mansion of its own. This in Charlottenburg, one of the newer districts in the West. He built this incredible mansion. Again, a lot of excess, if you will, but he wanted to show the world who he was. And he was certainly a very important figure. Bleichroder also managed to make his client Bismarck very wealthy. Bismarck didn't have much money on his own. He was a Junker landowner, but he wasn't very rich. But Bleichroder advised him on investments, right? And he got wealthy as a result of that. And in exchange for that, Bismarck did, he rewarded Bleichruder with all kinds of business enhancing political information, as well as the first hereditary title ever awarded to a Jew in the history of the German Reich. So Bleichruder, was given a title now, but behind his back, Bismarck often made anti-Semitic jokes, often made fun of Bleichruder. And as Bleichruder's biographer, Fritz Stern, has pointed out, there's a very good book. I'll mention books as we go along that I think are especially important for this. But in that book, Stern notes that Bleichroder's story exemplified the precariousness of Berlin's new financial plutocracy, full as it was of Jews who were the pariahs even among the plutocratic parvenus. That's a very good book. I recommend it highly. The biggest pariah of all among the new Jewish plutocratic parvenus was a man named Henry Bethel Strasbourg. He was a Jewish merchant son from East Prussia who made a fortune financing railroad construction in Germany and Eastern Europe. Yes, Strasbourg. He's thought to have become the richest man of all in Germany, even richer than Bleichruder. And he also became central to a financial fraud scheme that helped bring a bust to Berlin's boom. We'll talk about that bust in a minute, but for now, in my ongoing discussion of Berlin's material excess in this foundation era, I want to call attention to the mansion that Strasbourg built. That's what they do. They celebrate this is much bigger than Bleichruder's. It was on the Wilhelmstrasse. It certainly put Bleichruder's pile to shame. The material excess and ambitiousness of Berlin's plutocrats was echoed by an upwelling of municipal hubris too, on the part of the city's urban planners and agents. They hope to emulate and even surpass Paris as a city of grand boulevards and monuments and that kind of thing. So the first thing they turned their attention to was the idea of a grand street. Paris had the Champs-Élysées, so Berlin had to come up with something like that, and it invented the Kudamm, the Kurfürstendamm. There it is, the Kurfürstendamm. That it actually, you see it kind of coming toward us. The Grollmannstrasse goes up on the other side. I used to live right off that street. It's a very broad avenue running from the western edge of the Tiergarten or the city park to the Grunewald, which is a woody area that would soon become a favorite spot for the richest entrepreneurs in the city. This street, like its Parisian counterpart, housed upscale dwellings, apartments and so forth and so on, but also a lot of fancy shops. So that became part of the new Berlin. The most famous street connected to the old Berlin, Unter den Linden, also got really tarted up in this era. Unter den Linden was pretty dowdy in the 50s and 60s in the 19th century. But once unification came, like the Kurfürstendamm, the Wounded and Linden became host to all sorts of luxury stores, restaurants, hotels, and the like. The new shops tried to outdo each other in ornamental facades. Most gaudy of all of these was the so-called Kaiser Galerie. There you see it, which was meant to outdo Milan's Gallery Vittorio Emanuele. I'm sure it's still there, by the way, if those of you who go to Milan know that. Equally notable were some new hotels because now for the first time, Berlin actually needed hotels because it was attracting some 30,000 visitors a day compared to only about 5,000 before unification. The fanciest of the hotels was the Kaiserhof. There it is, which had over 300 rooms, and it had grand private bathrooms. This was a novelty. It had bathrooms with hot water tubs, an amenity which Kaiser Wilhelm I made frequent use of because he didn't have that in his own palace. No warm bathtubs in the palace. Up-and-coming cities, of course, needed more than just grand avenues and hotels and shops in order to make a credible claim to grandeur. They needed monuments. And Berlin's signature new monument, which I'm sure all of you know about if you've been to Berlin, was the Siegessäule, the victory column, of course, meant to symbolize Germany's victory over France. Originally, the Siegessäule was right near the parliament. It was moved later by the Nazis to its current location next to the Tiergarten. But it opened in 73, and it was a huge success right from the beginning, especially the golden victory goddess that tops the thing. There she is, the victory goddess. 19th century Berliners dubbed this lady the Golden Elsa, the Golden Elsa, after a prostitute named Elsa Hirsch, who was a favorite of the guy who designed the statue. But today's Berliners prefer to call her Chick on a Stick. All right, with that, let's take a break. We'll take a break and come back and finish this up. All right. Yeah. Yeah. Hi. How's it going? Good to see you. Happy New Year. How you doing?
I thought of you the other day because I went to see the movie Boys in the Boat.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I had already seen the documentary.
Right. I worked on that. Yeah.
It's a little Hollywoody version.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did a little consulting for them early on with the production.
Yeah.
Not too much because I've kind of lost interest in that whole story, but I'll see it. I'll go see it.
Yeah, it's it's fun to see.
Yeah, and
drama.
when we did the documentary, we spent a lot of time in the Husky boathouse, where they have the original boat hanging up there and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I saw it just the
Yeah,
other day.
yeah, I'm gonna see it. I'm
And
gonna go see it.
It's a Hollywood
Well,
production. But
yeah,
you're like,
yeah. Oh, sorry. All right, let's try to mosey back in and get going. Hi, good to see you. Good to see you. Yeah. I'm already behind, of course. So before I got going, there's a couple of questions came in from Zoom, and I wanted to address those um, before it started the second part of the lecture. Bob Tolan asks, at what point did you learn German? I had a tutor before I went to school in Vienna, and I thought I had learned a lot. Turned out I had a lot to learn by the time I got there, and it was real touch and go for a while for me. But I lived with a family there, and they helped me an awful lot. And so I was sink or swim, and I managed eventually to swim. And then ever since that time, I've gone back to German speaking areas almost every year, so I get a chance to practice. You got to practice. Another language I took when I was in Vienna was Chinese, Mandarin, and I got fairly decent at it, but then I didn't keep up with it. So I've lost almost all my Mandarin. It just pisses me off because I worked so hard to get it in the first place. Okay, that's one question. Ernie Newburn points out something very interesting with this name From. It's a surname, he says, derived from the Yiddish word frum, meaning orthodox or observant. Probably applied originally to observant Jews whose surnames became required after the French Revolution. I think that adds a special spice to the condom. And then Larry Schiller asks, were most of the homeless people coming into Berlin Jewish immigrants? I don't know if I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. A lot were, but I'm not sure it was most. Because there were lots of immigrants coming in, and by no means were all of them Jewish. So I think you could say, yes, a lot of them were Jewish, but it's certainly not exclusively Jewish. All right, let's move on to bust. I was talking about Berlin as a boom town. Well, that implies a bust, right? It's the nature of booms to bust. And this was especially true for Berlin. The House of Cards there collapsed quite quickly within just a few years of the beginning in 71. And why was that? Well, a lot of the new joint stock companies that were thrown up, like the Mietskaserne, were hollow fronts. They were fronts designed primarily to bilk unsophisticated investors, of which there were many, many. So there was that. And then Berlin's building explosion had been predicated on the illusion that the city would expand very quickly to 9 million. I mean, that was a little extreme. This, of course, did not happen. It did grow, but it didn't grow like that. But the fact that they were building so fast encouraged overbuilding, and thus a precipitous crash in rental values. There was a time when there was too much housing at prices that people could afford. Not enough housing, of course, for everybody by any means, no. But if you wanted a decent housing and had some money, there was an over supply, and that brought down the rents. Right, it led to a crash in rental values. Also, and this I think is probably most important, just like America's rail building in the Gilded Age, Germany's rail construction, especially Strasbourg's operations in Eastern Europe, were costing more than they brought in revenue. In the U.S., this was covered by all kinds of behind the scenes dealing. The same was true in Germany, where Strasbourg was giving backhanders to politicians who were covering up for him the real state of the finances. But that all broke apart. That all came to the fore suddenly in 73. The other thing that's crucial here is that something I mentioned earlier, Berlin's economy being dependent on the health of an international marketplace stretching from Vienna to New York. Financial tremors on the Danube or the Hudson could wreak havoc on the banks of the Spree. Indeed, the failure of a major bank in Vienna brought panic on the Berlin Bourse, the Berlin Stock Exchange in 1873. just as the crash of the New York Stock Exchange in 1929 would bring terrible financial calamity for Germany and Berlin. We'll talk about that later on. But back in 83, February 83, a Reichstag deputy by the name of Edward Lasker, there he is, stood before the parliament and exposed what he called a Strasbourg system of corruption in the whole railroad industry. It was, he said, just one scam after another. And this was the heart, one of the hearts of Germany's economic boom, railroad construction. The stock market was immediately hit, a process that was accelerated by the troubles in Vienna, and then brought to a crescendo by the collapse of a major New York brokerage house and the sudden closing of the New York Stock Exchange in 1873. I don't know if you know that happened, but the whole stock exchange closed in 1873. Excuse me. So just as would be the case in the early 1930s, in 1874, 73, banks and businesses in Germany and Berlin began folding by the dozens. And fingers of blame, of course, began fatefully pointing in their turn. Anxious to clear themselves of any wrongdoing, Berlin's conservatives in the political arena and also in building and finance pointed their fingers at the liberals, whose laissez-faire doctrines they claimed had invited corruption. And it's true that the laissez-faire policies did allow people to do things that they wouldn't have been able to do earlier, right? The liberalization of bank regulations, for example. All this should sound familiar to us. But it was blamed on the liberals who were seen as the corruptors in all of this. And it's also true that some of those liberal bankers and businessmen were Jewish. So indignant writers spoke of an international Jewish conspiracy behind the liberal policies. This cry was then picked up by lowbrow populist newspapers, as well as by some highbrow professors at Berlin University, most notably this guy, Heinrich von Treitschke, who was a famous nationalist historian who screamed, the Jews are our misfortune. That's a term that the Nazis later picked up on big time. The Jews are our misfortune. Another high-level but low-minded anti-Jewish finger pointer was Adolf Stucker, Protestant. He was the court chaplain. He was the head of the court service for the monarchy. He spoke of a need to fight what he called Jewish supremacy as part of a crusade to, and here I'm quoting him, restore German Christian culture and values. Even more significant in Berlin's anti-Jewish backlash was Otto von Bismarck himself, whose relationship with the Jewish banker Bleichroeder had led to charges on the right that the chancellor's own subservience to a Jew was responsible for the crash. So Bismarck immediately embarked on a very nasty program of personal damage control. He distanced himself publicly from Bleichroeder. He denounced Jewish street peddlers as part of the problem for Berlin. Here's a cartoon showing that. And he went on to suggest that the parliamentary whistleblower, Edward Lasker, who was also Jewish, was a part of the problem because what he had done, according to Bismarck, Lasker had engineered the financial crash himself in order to embarrass Bismarck. So this kind of thing, again, it sounds rather familiar to some of us in our own time. But this is what Bismarck did to prop up his position. And to further that as well, he actually moved the whole economic policy of the Reich away from free trade and liberal policy toward one of protectionism and state subsidies for domestic production, right? In other words, Berlin, having earlier been a center of free trade and laissez-faire liberalism, became a bastion of protectionism, right? Which often happens in populist regimes. Protectionism is part and parcel of right-wing populism. But Then we must ask, did this Berlin of the Bismarckian period become a true hotbed of anti-Semitism? A term, by the way, anti-Semitism, that was developed or coined, I should say, by a Berlin journalist by the name of Wilhelm Marr. That's where the word comes from. Well, it's certainly true that this mindset, anti-Semitism, gathered momentum in the city during the economic downturn. It's called the Depression of the Bismarck site from 83 to about 80, from 73 to about 79. The mindset did gather momentum, no doubt, with the economic downturn biting hard, and with Ostjuden, more Ostjuden pouring into the city. Anti-Semites like Stucker, and also like a high school teacher named Bernhard Förster, I got to mention him. There he is. Soon began to talk about all kinds of conspiracies and Jewish guilt. Bernhard Förster, by the way, was married to Elisabeth Nietzsche, the sister of Friedrich Nietzsche, who at the time was going crazy. He became a fanatical anti-Semite, this Förster character. He called publicly for a petition that would rescind equal rights for Jews, just deny them the rights that they've been granted by law since about the middle of the 19th century. Pumped up on the kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric pouring out of the mouths of people like Förster and Stucker, a mob, an anti-Semitic mob, also pumped up on booze, moved through the heavily Jewish Friedrichstadt region, beating up people who, quote unquote, looked Jewish, smashing windows and yelling, Juden raus, Jews, get out. So here we have a kind of pogrom right in Berlin, not on the scale that you would get in Poland or Russia, but still pretty damn scary. And of course, the first of others, many that we'll be talking about later on in this course. And yet, having said all of that, and as alarming and dangerous as anti-Semitic movements were in Berlin at this time, that movement failed to make really significant gains in the Berlin electorate. Electoral politics in Berlin at this time, at any rate, did not get dominated at all by the anti-Semitic parties. There was a specific anti-Semitic party, by the way. Moreover, the anti-Semitism generated a backlash to the backlash with prominent Berliners like the great historian Theodor Mommsen coming out and speaking loudly against anti-Semitism, and also the Social Democratic Party, the party of the working classes, condemning this plague as well. Frustrated then that his anti-Jewish party was not making much headway in Berlin, Bernhard Förster, with his wife Elisabeth Nietzsche and a few followers, left Berlin in a huff and decamped to Paraguay in the jungles in order to establish a new pure Aryan community they called Nueva Germania. What an idea, huh? Well, as you can imagine, Nueva Germania didn't last very long. And Förster committed suicide, while Elizabeth returned to Germany to tend to her mentally ill brother and to edit his works in a way to make them more conformist to the racist ideology of the day and later on. There's another really good book about this, if you're interested, called Forgotten Fatherland. That's about the Nueva Germania, and then the one on Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche is this one. I will eventually provide a reading list for the entire course, but all along the way, I'm going to show you some books that I think are especially interesting and worth looking for. As for Berlin, its Bismarckian era brush with anti-Semitism didn't take on wider proportions, in part because by the very end of the 70s and early 80s, the city was beginning to recover economically. And that was assisted by Germany's adoption of the gold standard, hugely important for Germany, and by the belated introduction, finally, of a common currency. Germany didn't have one until then, the Reichsmark. There it is. Also helpful was the fact that the local economy now became dominated by solid industrial firms, not those shaky joint stock operations, but industrial firms like Borzig, or like Siemens. You've all heard of Siemens, I suppose. And Siemens was started in Berlin at a huge factory there. Also, the German Edison company, which rivaled the American Edison company in terms of clout, or the chemical giant Agfa, which made early cameras and film. These were all mainstays of the so-called second industrial revolution, right? That would soon catapult Berlin into world prominence in technology. I was talking about Berlin being, a hotbed of modernism. Well, this is one of the ways in which that happened. At the same time, the city was embarking on much needed infrastructural improvements. For example, a new steam railway system that wound around the city opened up, the so-called Ringbahn, and electric street lighting now replaced gas lanterns in the 80s and 90s. Berlin was one of the first places to do that, to get electrified. Also, a new municipal water service brought in clean water from outside the city for the expanding metropolis. Berlin water was mostly pretty good, and it remains great today. It's some of the cleanest and best water you'll ever find anywhere. A new sewer system was introduced, which to take human waste outside the city to surrounding truck farms, giving Berliners the added satisfaction of personally aiding in the growth of their food. Another sanitary measure came in the form of public bathhouses. Most houses didn't have their own bathrooms or bathhouses, but here you get these really palatial, and these were ordinary people, these great bathhouses, which, if nothing else, made it more pleasant for Berliners to ride together in the new public trolleys. One final improvement I must mention was the installation of special sidewalk pillars for the posting of advertisements, which heretofore had just been spread all over buildings and the sidewalks and so forth, making a terrible mess. Now you had the introduction of what were called Litfaßsäule. Paris had them too. The Berlin guy who developed them had also worked in Paris. They're called Litfaß because Edward Litfaß was the Berliner who pioneered these things. They were also called dicke Damen, thick or fat ladies by the Berliners, and they became as characteristic a part of the Berlin scene as the living ladies advertising their charms along the Friedrichstrasse. We'll talk more about that in a bit. I see I'm just about out of time. What I think I'm going to do is take a break here and let you have some questions. There's more that I can segue into the next lecture on Berlin as a place for diplomatic conferences and so forth, but I don't want to not allow any questions. So let me stop and get some questions, and then we'll proceed along the way. And I'll yes, go ahead, John. Yeah, John's question, were the Berliners, the Germans, borrowing on American technology like Edison? Absolutely, especially Edison. There was a real rivalry between a German manufacturer and entrepreneur for the first photographic, for the first movie camera and that kind of stuff. So yes, there was a lot of borrowing going back and forth. There were Germans already coming to the U.S. to see what was going on over here. Other questions? Yes, please.
Background said from 17 on that you were interested in Germany.
Yes.
Did you speak German before you went there? And do you have a German family, or what got you so
Okay. Yeah, the question is, did I speak German early on? Did I come from a German family? Not really. My mother, Lois Altmann, came from an German-Austrian Austrian Jewish family, but not my father. And I didn't speak German growing up at home or anything like that. But I had a tutor when I knew I was going to Vienna. I had a tutor, and he was very good. And then I studied my ass off in Vienna. And as I said earlier, I've been going back ever since. Yes, please. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Oh, Versailles. I mentioned, I showed you that painting. It's an Anton von Werner painting of the crowning of the Kaiser in Versailles. The Germans did that. They'd beaten the French, right? And they were creating their own new Reich, right? Their own new empire. And they chose Versailles as the place to do that in order to show the French who was boss now, in order to rub salt in the wounds of the defeated French. No question about that. Also, it made the new German Kaiser look a little bit like Louis XIV, right? That kind of thing. It was a way of showing off power. I think in an especially cruel way, by the way. I think diplomatically that was stupid. It wasn't Bismarck's idea, by the way, for that. He had his doubts about it, but he let it happen. It was more the generals who wanted that to happen. Yes. Reich means it can mean a state, it can mean an empire. The Reich implies the pulling together of the various German states into one entity, right? So you had kingdoms. Bavaria had a kingdom. There was one in Baden, in Saxony, and so forth and so on. Or there was a duchy in Baden. But anyway, all those states get pulled into what they call the Reich. Now, there had been Reichs before. The Holy Roman Empire was a Reich. Was also called a Reich. But in the Weimar period, the German state was also called a Reich, right? It's not just Hitler or something like that. It was called the Reich then as well. Another question. Yes, please. Yes. Yeah, well, yeah, the question is, were other countries, let's just were other countries as anti-Jewish as Germany? A lot of countries were much more anti-Jewish. Germany actually pioneered in laws opening up civil and political rights to Jews. So that's why these Jews from Poland and from other parts of Eastern Europe, especially Russia, came fleeing into the German area. Bavaria too. A lot of them came to Bavaria. So yeah, I mean, and France, of course, also got a number of Jews, but France had its own traditions of anti-Semitism, as we all know. Think of the Dreyfus case later on. Yeah, please. Yes, yes, it did, and it had a branch in Frankfurt. Absolutely, it was definitely a power at this point, and big, not as much in Berlin. It was based in Frankfurt. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. I'm going to have a whole section about how these various parts of Berlin come together in one city. That didn't happen until 1920. Oh, the question, let me repeat the question for the Zoom audience. I keep talking about these various parts of Berlin, and the question was, well, how did they come together as a city? They weren't together really fully in an administrative sense as a metropolitan entity until 1920. When a kind of brief political opening allowed that to happen. And then a whole number of suburbs were brought into the metropolitan area as a single entity, which of course greatly increased the population of Berlin. But we'll talk about that when we get to the early Weimar era. Yes, please. One or two more questions, and then we'll have to. Yes, please. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the question or the comment has to do with the irony, and it is an irony that Germany would be the place to which so many Jews would flee and would see as a place for freedom and opportunity when we know what was to happen, what was to become of Jews in Germany down the line. Yes, it's ironic, and yet one can certainly see why Polish or Russian Jews would have wanted to to go to Berlin at this particular, or not just Berlin, but the German states at this particular time. It made sense for them. It really made sense. And of course, they couldn't predict what was going to happen down the line. There was anti-Semitism in Germany at the time, but it wasn't nearly as fierce as it was in the East. So, and the reasons for the anti-Semitism getting out of line and out of hand is something we're going to have to talk about down the line, right? But yeah, there's an irony there. No question about it. Yes, Jerry. Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Berlin, as I said, in 1870, 71 was only about 860 some thousand. It climbed very quickly to up to 2 million in 1904, 1905. It reached its peak population in 1939 or so because so many people were fleeing into the city from outside because of the war. The war, the beginning of the war, and so forth and so on. It continued to climb in the early period of the war, Second World War, because Berlin wasn't bombed until later, you see, but other places were. So people were actually fleeing into Berlin to escape. It's at its peak, Berlin had a little over 4 million people. It's never reached that again. It now has close to, it's 3.9 something million right now, but a little over 4 million, 4.3, something like that. It's bigger than Vienna. Yeah. Yes. Good question. She's tough. She's just tough. She offered her services to anybody who came by. No. Yeah. And it was damaged. The statue was damaged. She was damaged too, but they fixed her up after the war. They didn't want to lose that. It's one of the iconic symbols of Berlin. The question again, I'm sorry, I didn't for the Zoom. Yeah, the question was, why did this golden victory goddess, remain there after all the fighting and all the horrors? And I said it was because she's tough, but also she did get damaged. Yeah, she did. One more question. Yes, please. I'm sorry, what is what? I still can't get the. Oh, when did the bust? 73, 1873. Starting in the fall of September of 1873, there was a bank crash in Vienna, and then there was the crash in New York. And I mentioned how dependent Berlin was on the international financial network, but it recovered fairly quickly. It wasn't as long as the Depression by any means. It recovered. The city recovered. Germany recovered by the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. I've been handed a couple of other questions from Zoom, and then we'll have to call it quits. Larry Schiller says, and how many of the former East Berlin are covered with graffiti? Very ugly. Oh, and now, yeah, he says much of East Berlin is covered in graffiti. That's true. Actually, there's graffiti all over, and it's ugly. But there's less now than there was 10 years ago, I think. I think it's actually declining. And Ernie Newburn, you didn't mention Rothschild or Warburg as Jewish bankers. Were they not in Berlin? And as I said before, they were headquartered in Frankfurt. So they eventually did open a branch in Berlin, but their origin was in Hesse. Okay. All right. That's it for today. I'll continue with on next week.
Thank you, everyone on Zoom, also for your participation and your comments. Please know that you can always ask questions and comments here, and I'll relay them as best I can to David. We will see you all next week. What a great class. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed.